Okay, so I'll pass you over to Keith. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for the invitation to come along today. I was here for the previous event, the Aberdeen Independence Movement event, which was actually quite a landmark really, because if you remember, for those that were here, I did say at the time that I thought it could not be the position of either the independence movement or the SNP, as movements founded upon the principle of self-determination, that if we wanted to have a referendum, we could ever not call for one just because we expected the UK government would say no. I think it's a fairly straightforward statement. I think it's self-evident if you're a movement based on self-determination. But shortly afterwards, the Tories got hold of that, and Linda and Broadcast Scotland had been filming it, and it was shown, and it was apparently a cry for a wildcat referendum. And they called me Keith Wildcat Brown, which my partner, Christina McKelvey, actually quite liked, and she's been calling me that ever since, actually. Christina and I are here because we want to be here. I should be at NEC today, but I've come here instead. But it's also true to say we did a burn supper in Inverurie last night, and we're away to one in Keith tonight as well. But it's good to be here. Last time I was here, the breakout sessions and the discussion were great, and the vibrancy of the event was great. So I was keen to come back. Obviously, it's been a big week this week, and actually, although a lot happened yesterday, some of the things which have happened even today I think are very significant. So the vote by unison to support the right of the Scottish Parliament to both hold and decide when to hold a referendum, I think is very significant. I think also Christina were members of Unison. I was a shop steward and a branch officer for many years, and that is some distance that they've travelled, and I think it's very significant as well. It's the biggest trade union in Scotland, and it'd be interesting to see what the other trade unions do behind that. Interesting also to see these trade union loving Labour MSPs, what they now say in the Scottish Parliament. But it does underline, I think, a very important point, which in this week has been, I think, for many of us, if we're honest, extremely frustrating, especially last night. We had at the burn supper, when it came to 11 o'clock, we had a piper who played a lament and then played Ode to Joy afterwards. There was quite a few tears in the room, because whatever your view of the EU, people felt something very important had changed. I've said before that I've got two sons, as well as a daughter here in Aberdeen. My older son was very involved in the independence campaign, and on the night that we went to the count for the referendum, of course, my constituency was the first to report, and that kind of set the pattern for the night. So he immediately burst into tears when he heard the result. My other son, though, he was involved in the campaign, did some canvassing, but it was actually the Brexit referendum that affected him more. He just felt, at a relatively young age, he's now 23, he felt that his world had grown smaller overnight, and he was profoundly affected by that. And I think there is a real sadness in what's happened, and some of the revelling in it. If you see some of the stuff on Twitter from some of the places around the UK, Adondon, Union Jacks and all the rest of it is really quite depressing. So there's no question that's going to lead to a heightened sense of frustration and impatience, and rightly, amongst people in the Yes movement and in the SNP. Now, I'd say from my point of view, I joined the SNP in 1984, it's now 36 years ago. I joined at university, and at that time we had a by-election actually almost right away in Broughty Ferry, which as it happens on the 13th of December, a tough time, as we know, to campaign. But the SNP won that by-election actually quite comfortably. A guy called Ken Guild, who fairly recently was the leader of Dundee City Council. But at that time, going around, first time I'd ever been out canvassing, one in every maybe 20 doors, or maybe one every 15 doors, was willing to speak to you about the SNP, even fewer about the idea of independence. And so if you look at the way that we've travelled since then, and I got interviewed the morning after, right through the night in fact, of the independence referendum. I went to the County Clackmannanshire, which is where my constituency is, and also have a bit of Stirling, so I went there, and then I went straight through to the studios and was doing media through till about 10 o'clock. I had the glorious experience of being on the panel when Ian Murray walked in just as the final result was announced, so you can imagine how much fun that was. But afterwards, I did a radio interview with Bill Robertson on GMS, and he asked me, he said two things. He said, one was, that's it, a generation. And I said, as I said before, first of all, I have never said it was once in a generation. Secondly, I said, no, there's no way that you can tell the people of Scotland when they decide, and this is on the day of the referendum or just after it, There's no way you can tell people in Scotland when they can have a referendum. You can't do that in any country. That's the basic principle of self-determination. And he also said to me, you must be gutted. And I said, I genuinely am, and I wasn't as bad as my son or many other people, which is kind of ironic given how long I'd been at the game, but I thought 45% for independence. I was a wee bit miffed, if I'm honest, about the fact that my two sons, who'd never had a vote in their life, the first vote they get is a chance to vote for independence, and I've been trying to get that for 30 odd years, and I get it at the same time as them. But I thought 45%. Of course, I'd love to have had that little bit more, and think of how much better shape we'd be in now as a country had we just gone that little bit further. But I thought 45% was a fantastic achievement, not least where we started from, even in that campaign. So I think we have to bear that in mind, and also the fact we've had a poll this week which showed 51% support for independence. Now, probably more significant than that 51% figure is the fact there's a 7% swing going on there from the last poll that YouGov did, and that's what you should do. You always compare the same question by the same polling company if you want to get a true comparison, and that's a significant shift, 7%. Hopefully James Kelly, I know a number of us have contributed to his crowdfunder, that he will do a poll. There's precious few polls on independence. It'd be good to get one which asks a straight question and gives us a good idea. But the basic point is that there's no shortcut to independence. There's no way past convincing more than 50% and one person to vote for independence in a properly constituted referendum. There's no other way to go around that, although there are other ways to help achieve that. And interestingly, Nicola yesterday spoke about the idea of a consultative referendum. Personally, my view is that things like the unison decision today, the convention which has been mentioned, where we get all the elected representatives in Scotland, not just who are SNP or Green or who believe in independence, but those who believe in the right of self-determination. And that should be, it might not be, but it should be a bigger number just in the SNP and Green councillors. Because you really have to believe in self-determination or you don't. And you don't believe in self-determination if you put conditions on it. It can only happen when Nicola Sturgeon dies, or 50 years' time, or if you get a majority plus 20, whatever the conditions are, they're a nonsense. You either believe in the principle of self-determination or you don't. And I think it'd be really useful to have a test, and this will be the big issue, and there are different ways to achieve this, a proper test of public opinion on Scotland that explicitly talks about a right to have that referendum. Now, the Unionists have said every mandate that's been granted, if you like, they've questioned it on different grounds. The one that is more difficult is the idea of demand for a referendum. And I think an explicit statement by the people of Scotland on that, I think, would be very compelling to get through this current logjam. I have to say I've been very surprised by the approach the Tories have taken since then. This kind of, I mean, it's even got as bad as this last week. Alistair Jack, after Christina and I and our colleagues in the Scottish Parliament have voted again to have a referendum, it doesn't matter a jot, was his answer. I mean, it's almost like they're playing into our hands with the contempt that they're so willing to display just now. And I think that's the crucial point. For me, and I was just saying earlier on, that both the European elections last year and the December election, there was a real change happened then. And it was, if we're honest, it was a middle class vote which had not been willing to countenance supporting either the SNP or independence. Some would have supported the Greens. In my constituency in Bridge of Allen, the Greens have a level of support there. But they weren't willing to countenance it. But what had changed was Brexit, of course, has been a big change. And I mentioned Bridge of Allen. We've got Stirling University there. Now, they've been pleading with me for years now. Principal was a big no voter, now a big yes voter. They're losing staff. They can't attract staff anymore. They're losing students. And the students that do go, even those from the UK, are getting a lesser experience because the diversity of the student body is not what you want to have. When you go to university, you want to meet people from different cultures and to have that kind of experience. But we noticed in the European elections, I live in a place called Dollar, quite middle class, and next to it's a smaller village called Muckert. We were getting some quite extraordinary returns during that election. And it wasn't just Brexit, it was also the people who had previously voted no, their faith in UK institutions had been completely shaken. They'd watched as all the veils were stripped away about the naked nature of power in the UK state. And I think that's a really significant thing which we've not paid enough attention to. And we can't be squeamish about it. We're going to have to get middle class voters we're going to have to get no voters to vote yes if we're going to get independence. We can talk and we can bicker amongst ourselves endlessly about what's the best way, and that's perfectly legitimate in a democratic movement. But unless we convince more people that previously voted no, we're not going to achieve what it is that we want. And I think the thing that's changed in some people's minds, they think about two unions. So if you think about the union in the UK and Scotland's place in it, first of all, it barely resembles a democracy anymore. The majority of people that make the laws in this country are not elected. They're appointed because they've contributed money or they've won the favour of some Prime Minister or other. I mean, that's something worth thinking about. This is meant to be, we're told, the mother of all democracies. The majority of the legislature are not elected. Now that really questions whether it's a democracy. Beyond that, the way the Scottish Government has gone about things, they have reasonably put two propositions to the UK Government which did not say, we demand, we've obviously said that as well previously, we demand that the people of Scotland who voted 62% Remain should have their rights respected. It was saying, right, if that is the vote across the UK, this is the best way to protect Scotland, keep us in the single market and keep us in the customs union. Reasonable, documented, worked out responses completely ignored by the UK Government. And we saw another example of that this week, when a well worked out document, which actually had a number of Tories supporting the idea prior to its publication, of a different immigration or visa system for Scotland, within hours dismissed. If you look at the way that the SNP MPs are treated, and Richard Gordon's here, one of the new MPs, and he's just getting used to this experience now, the absolute contempt. This is the majority of Scotland's representatives. They've been told to go and commit suicide, to go back home, likened to slaves. When anyone gets up to speak, then the others are this coordinated thing of leaving the chamber. And I think people are noticing that. People previously not convinced of independence. It's like all the kind of pretences around the British state have been sort of taken away. And it was an interesting thing, if you remember when the SNPs in a previous parliament walked out, and that was because we've been ignored repeatedly. If you remember, Mundell said, oh, if you've got reasonable amendments, we'll consider those. And then they didn't consider them in the House of Commons, and they said, well, they'll be considered in the House of Lords. And then they didn't consider them, and it came back to the House of Commons, and they had 17 minutes, during which a Tory minister filibustered. I mean, absolute contempt for any views from Scotland. And they walked out. The interesting thing about that, I had just been elected as a deputy leader of the SNP, and there was a demonstration outside the Scottish Parliament, spontaneous demonstration. The SNP also put on around 7,000 new members, and the Greens also put on a load of new members after that. And I went out and spoke to it, and there's people that had never been involved in politics before, and I was asking them what's occasioned this. And bear in mind that in my time in the SNP, through the 80s and the 90s, trying to make constitutional points to people who are much more concerned about other things was very difficult. And yet that walkout seemed to register with people. It's a constitutional issue. It registered and it told them how much our views are treated with contempt. So that's the union that we're in just now. I think the latest one is the Scottish Government's been told they're not going to be allowed to travel overseas by the UK. They're not going to have permission to travel overseas by the UK Government. This is Alistair Jack. I mean, absolutely unbelievable. It won't happen to Wales, incidentally, just Scotland. Or that the First Minister's not allowed to go to the climate change conference in Glasgow. And I can imagine them trying to stop Nicola going to that conference. Good luck to them in that. But the contrast, and again going back to these previous no voters, if you look at the union that we had in the EU, and it's not a perfect union, I know that, it's too much power with France and Germany, you've got some really dodgy stuff going on, to call it, to be as polite as we can be, in Hungary, in Romania, what they've done in Catalonia, the Spaniards have done there. So I've never said the EU is a perfect organisation. It's got real issues, but I think despite all that, it's absolutely critical. I said last night at the Burn Supper, its overriding achievement is peace. And I was saying as well, Christine and I were lucky enough to go to Dubrovnik last year on holiday. We went into the old town, and you can still see all the shell marks and also the bullet marks from the Balkans War that was there. That has since become an EU country, and whilst we were there, we went to get some dinner in one of the open squares. There was a string quartet playing, and they started playing Ode to Joy, and spontaneously all these people started singing in different languages ode to joy. It was an absolutely fantastic experience. And that's a country that had gone from war in 1995, whenever it was, to this peaceful place where people from all nationalities could coincide together. Incidentally, the newest member of the EU that uses its own currency, even though next door you've got Montenegro, which is not in the EU, which uses the euro. Just the point, and I often use that, I did that with Willie Rennie on Sky once. He was saying it couldn't happen, you'd have to have the euro. How do you explain Croatia and so on? So people see the EU, and its overriding achievement, I think, is peace, and you can just brush past that very quickly. It's helped achieve, it got a Nobel Prize actually for its peace achievements. But you try the absence of peace, what it's like, and if you talk to people in Croatia, what it was like for them, or the people that served in the Second and First World Wars, all consuming, affected every part of your life. Every family lost people, and it took out huge chunks of those that survived their lives. So the absence of peace is not good, and perhaps we can sometimes take peace for granted. And the EU was a major proponent of that. Aside from that, I think peace and prosperity have been what the EU has been about, and it's been far better being in the EU than it has been out with the EU. And we're about to experience what it's like to be out with the EU. But the crucial thing is the way it operates. So if Scotland was an independent member of the EU, we'd have somebody in the Council of Ministers, party to every decision. Ironically, the UK won 95% of the decisions that it had votes on whilst it was a member of the EU. It wasn't this case of the EU telling the UK what to do. We would have a say in that, we would have double the number of MEPs, we would have a commissioner, but crucially, we'd be listened to. We wouldn't get that contempt that you see at Westminster. Some people have called the EU the tyranny of the tiny because it's the small countries that can drive things when they come together. So that kind of union, which is a confederal union, which is about the sovereignty of individual nation states agreeing to pool their, that is so different from the utter contempt we're seeing from an undemocratic union in the UK. And I think that's what's moved some people that bit further. So I'll conclude, because I'm happy to take any questions, just by saying I think we are around 50% strong, at least in Scotland just now, in terms of support for independence. We have to keep, whatever scenario plays out, and this is a lot more fluid than people perhaps appreciate, whatever scenario plays out, there's no scenario in which continuing to talk to people that are not yet convinced about independence isn't the right thing to do. We've got a by-election in my constituency. It's not one that we currently hold. And we will do, as we did in December, as we did at the European elections, ask the question, put the case for independence every time we try to get a vote. That is never a wasted effort. And if we see people like Unison coming on board, if we see some of the things which have happened over the last few weeks with people really quick, Malcolm Chisholm, for those that have seen Twitter today, now saying independent, ex-Labour MP, ex-Labour Minister, Labour MSP, a very good guy. Christine and I both worked with him in the Scottish Parliament, now coming out for the first time ever today saying he thinks independence is the only way. He likes federalism, but he understands that in the UK that will not get him back into the EU. So if you get people like that, and he's an influential person, Malcolm Chisholm, David Martin saying some interesting things, many others, it eventually just becomes unstoppable. And for those of us that lived through the 80s and 90s with the change in the constitutional position, the increasing frustration that built up with Tory governments, and it came like a flood at the end. That other referendum, in 1997, I remember the 1979 referendum, but the 1997 referendum, again, Mansell was the first to announce huge support, both for devolution and also for tax raising powers. And that is building up just now. And the way we build it further is not by castigating or having a go at those that are either not yet convinced or have only recently become convinced. We don't go, I've been at this for 35 years, you've been at it for 35 minutes. Everyone's voice is equal in this. If you treat people with respect, then I think there's much more chance of bringing them onto our ground. And I think we're in that process just now. So I think this is by far the most exciting time in the last 36 years that I've had. And it's within our hands now. It's very, very close. And I think events like this help that, continue talking to people, increasing understanding. So thanks very much for the chance to talk to you today.
Okay, Keith will take a few questions.
Thank you. You might, I was listening to FMQs, I think it was either this week or last week, Adam Tompkins recognised, as he was speaking on the Tory front bench, that Scotland has a sovereign right. And I always listen, you know, with my jaw dropping as I hear them say that, given the position. Now, you said that the 92-page document on visas, which would have helped everyone actually, and didn't conflict with anything, was backed by Tories in their party before it was published. So it just really comes back to the theme that you've given us. I mean, you've probably covered all the things I'm going to say anyway, but I know a number of people, and I know we need to win people that vote no, we need to win the middle class voter, we need to vote people, older farmers, for example, you know, and it's a question of how do you chip away. I know a number of very intransigent people who will just not open up to this conversation. And they've got all the facts because I've hammered them with them countless times. And the only reason I've ever hammered them with them is because, if I can say it, people that are quite far to the right that I know well have spent quite a large part of their lives hammering me with the union argument, and I've found the only way to come back at them, to try to get them to listen, is to give them a wee bit of their own medicine. But I cannot say it works. You know, what do you, I know we have to keep talking, but how do we reach these people?
It's a really good question, and I don't pretend to have, you know, the kind of silver bullet that provides the answer. But one thing I have found that works quite well, and I got elected to the council in 1996. I got elected a majority of 4, and which Stephen Gethins was always very jealous of. But I realised that that was a pretty divided community. I got 602 votes, Labour got 598, and I knew that many people did not like the SNP or didn't like me in that situation. Now, my majority at the last Scottish Parliament election for the same area is around 7,000 now, and it's grown at each election. Now, there's reasons for that, of course. There's bigger issues going on than just how I represent people locally. But I know that many people who have either had to come and see me or wanted to come and see me who had a completely different point of view. And if you treat them with respect, if you listen to what they say, and if, when you can, you help them, then over time that's changed people's minds. But the kind of people you're talking about, we can all relate to. You've been to a door when somebody is just, no, I'm not listening. This is the only thing I found, or the most effective thing that I found to work, and it doesn't always work, is try and find common ground. There's often an argument related to defence in there somewhere. So I talk a bit about my previous experience a long time ago in the armed forces, and if you find something on which there's common ground, then you can start to come back at the other arguments. So I found that has been perhaps the most effective thing to do. But there are, just to answer your point directly, there are a group that you're not going to change. And what I've noticed in this last 3 or 4 years is, I mean, I've been called a coward, a traitor. I've had death threats to me and my family. Someone's going to burn down my house. The tenor of the debate, Christina's had some horrendous death threats as well, representing Hamilton, Stonehouse and Larkhall. So, and most MSPs will be the same. So the nature of it's changed, and there are some people you're not going to convince. The last thing I would say is, don't give up on Adam Tompkins. Look at where he started, and look at where he was a few. You know, they're all Remainers. They're all ardent Brexiteers now. When we win their independence very shortly, Tompkins will say it was all down to him, and he'll give you the arguments as to why he convinced folk who should be independent. You know, but there are, and that will happen. You'll get people that will say we had to go through this process to be properly independent, whatever it is. So don't give up on people, and everyone can be convinced. Although for the practical purposes of an independence campaign, concentrate on those that have got some willingness to listen to some of the arguments and try and find some common ground, I would say.
Jake?
Hi. Yeah, Jake Malloy, organiser of the R&D, and currently a SDUC General Council member. Picking up on the point you made about unison, I get the impression of the union movement in Scotland at General Council that there's a growing move towards the independence agenda, which was different 4 years ago. I'm wondering if SNP will continue with the agenda for greater devolved powers as we continue with the debate around independence, because talked earlier about what's coming for Westminster in terms of employment rights, health and safety law, deregulation. You know, that would be quite a significant bit of leverage, if you like, for that argument. And I'm keen to see the party continue with that debate. Will that continue?
Yes, and I think the visa thing was an example of that. And both talking to our Westminster group, I was down with Richard's group at the AGM, and people in the Scottish Parliament, there will be that discussion. It happens all the time. Sometimes it happens in correspondence between ministers. Just more generally, and I can speak a bit more freely than the government ministers can, I think the current Smith settlement is an absolute mess. I mean, you could even say in some issues, regardless of which government it's sat with, it should be completely dealt with by that government. I think it should all be in Scotland, obviously, but if you look at the consumer protection stuff, it's a mess the way it doesn't make any sense to anybody. And if the public don't understand where powers lie, then that's not good. What is interesting, you mentioned employment rights, Jake, and I think that we've seen a change in the Labour Party's approach, because obviously in the Smith Commission they were adamant employment rights should not come to Scotland. Some Labour MSPs are now saying that was wrong and it should have happened, and it should. We could legislate for a living wage, and currently we can't do that. So yes, that argument, Scottish Government ministers do it on a regular basis, but I have to say, unlike the early years of the Cameron government, when there was a bit of discussion, I mean genuine discussion about what would be best as a solution, and that was obviously pre-referendum. Now it's not, it's a blanket no. Whatever you ask for, it's a no. And in fact, they're looking to go the other way. I should have said when I was talking about the changes and the contempt for the Scottish Parliament is LCMs are meaningless now. This idea that the Scottish or Welsh Parliament have to give consent for a measure which affected their devolved areas it's just gone. And if you remember in the court case in the Supreme Court, Lord Keane, who represents the UK Government Attorney General, said it was only a self-denying ordinance, i.e. they can decide when they want to observe that and when they don't. Contrast that with what we're being told during the referendum. Scottish Parliament entrenching law can never be abolished, and we'll never do anything against the wishes of the consent of the Scottish Parliament. That's just gone now, the contempt that's there. So that's fed its way through into every single request that I'm aware of. Christina would know better than me now, it's a while since I've been in government, but it's routinely just dismissed. Even the most logical and sensible things. Even sometimes when the minister that you're sitting on the other side of the table with knows it's the right thing to do. If he or she doesn't say no, the civil servants would soon tell him with the government line, say no to the Scottish Government. So, but I'm sure the SNP government will continue trying to make that case.
What's your thoughts on the massive increase in staff in the Scottish office and the budget increase that they've got? Do you fear any of your powers in Holyrood being eroded?
I think if you're going to commandeer RAF jets, and you're going to have a budget for that, I don't know if you've seen this, Alistair Jack got transported in an RAF jet to go to a drinks reception. I mean,
It was whiskey.
Whiskey, well, it was whiskey. It wasn't in Scotland though, but the odd thing is, if any Scottish minister had done anything approaching that, that would be, you can imagine the furore they would be. But so, yes, they've got a budget. I would say that some of it is, if not legitimate, then it's explicable, because that new building they've got in Edinburgh will accommodate many previous people, like some of the tax people that have come from elsewhere as well. It's not all an increase. But, you know, successive governments have tacitly acknowledged, going back to the Blair government, the functions of the Scottish office are pretty much redundant in many ways. And yet, as you've said, in the last 2 or 3 years, especially on PR, it's grown exponentially. And even putting that office where it is right below St Andrew's House is like putting our tanks on our lawn, I think. So it's a statement of intent. But it was interesting, of course, I forget whatever the particular scandal of the day was, that Alistair Jack, when he went to open it, had to scurry away instead. Something had happened that day and he wanted to avoid the cameras. The big event, I forget what it was. Anyway, so I wouldn't assume that all the people there are, you know, working full time on how to do down the Scottish Government, but that PR wing and what they spend on social media and communications, that is all about going after it. And the latest thing is apparently this, I forget who was in charge of it in the UK government, is to reduce support for independence from 45% to 35%. You don't do that without spending money in communications. At least some of the UK budget expenditure in the Scottish Government, some of it's transparent. It's the stuff that's less transparent perhaps we want to worry about as well.
Hi, I think my name's Scott Veterans, but also from a communications background. I just follow follow through into our lives and the real changes that will come from that are going to be in 2021 and onwards. So just wondering how the party plans to sort of communicate, keep that momentum going, if that's the right word.
It's a really good point, and actually before I came in I was talking with Linda and she reminded me not just about the wildcat reference I made last time, but also to my concern, as I said at that time, about Brexit becoming normalised. And that's a real issue, because the new bag, and it's going to be worse than it was before, whatever else it is, people kind of get used to it.
It's not bad for a year. That's a long time.
Well, that's right, and that gives them a bridge to that. Although some things will be bad right away. We are now no longer EU citizens. We don't have many of those rights, although much of the practical things won't change very quickly, as you say. But I think what do you do with that? I think it's really important that both the movement and certainly the SNP, and in particular the Scottish Government, have to highlight each time an opportunity is lost, a right is denuded, and that's happening fairly regularly. And you can do that in two ways. One is to point out what's happened and how it affects us, and secondly is to point to the other option. So I think the Scottish Government over the last 2 or 3 years has consciously massively increased its reach overseas. That's why the UK Government's trying to stop it. They've got new offices in France and Germany and Canada and Japan and China, and I think they have to increasingly act like a responsible aspirant EU independent nation to provide that contrast. But you're right, and we've all got to do that. Be very alert to what's changing in a negative way and point it out. And there's some people, I don't want to have a go at people, but there are some people, especially you see on Twitter, who are rejoicing about somebody saying it's great because Germany can't control it. Germany never controlled us, Somebody else said it was great because we can get control of our infrastructure again. Now you drive around Scotland, you look at the infrastructure that was supported by the EU. And in fact, when Thatcher made the calculation in the 80s to take regional aid away from everywhere essentially but the Midlands of England, because she'd worked out you can have a perpetual majority by making sure you win Middle England as she saw it, as well as the South. It was the EU that stepped in to Wales, to Scotland, to Northern England, Northern Ireland. They were the ones that helped with the infrastructure. If you look at what the EU's done to the infrastructure in Ireland, I mean, it's huge. So, but people have convinced themselves, and I think the most ironic is these people that are expats, as they're called, living elsewhere, suddenly concerned about their freedom of movement. So I think it's important that you're right, we cannot be complacent about this. We have to continue to point out when we're losing our rights. I think that will be helped by, in a perverse way, the difficulty that Boris Johnson is going to find over trade deals. Some of the statements he's made in the last couple of days are completely incompatible with any reasonable trade deal. And when the implications of that become more obvious, again, I think it will register with people. And it will register with people, politics is personal. So to the farmers who've suddenly seen a massive increase in their feed costs and things like that, and 2 or 3 people mentioned farmers. If the fisher folk end up, as we believe they've all been sold down the river, excuse the pun, once again, then again it's already registered with the fish processing sector, but some of some very wealthy families have got very big operations. I think it will register with them as well. So it is not going to be, I think, good Brexit. We do have to point out that fact. Some of it will be pointed out for us. They've now got to show us the green, sunny, uplit lands of this fantastic Brexit, and it's not going to happen. But I think you're right. We cannot let Brexit become normalised, and this year of transition, we have to be particularly aware of that.
Any more questions? Yep.
Thank you for your speeches. I'm just wondering, you were saying that not everything is great in Europe, but what would you change in Europe? What would you reform? What would be your vision? How would Scotland have a bigger impact within the European Union?
I think the Council of Ministers in particular is something I think should be made much more transparent. I worked in Europe for a number of years on the Committee of the Regions, which I would also like to see changed and made stronger. The Committee of the Regions is essentially almost like a local regional government parliament, but it has none of those powers. I think that should be strengthened as well. I think also too much was carved up between Germany and France. If you look at where, for example, the President of the Commission was chosen, that discredits, I think, the EU. So I think it has to be democratised. It's got to be made more transparent. But what is crucial in all of that is that the rights of individual nation states are prominent. I believe in a confederal Europe, not a federal Europe. I've never believed in ever closer political union. I don't think that's my own view. Some people do, and it's perfectly legitimate. It's not my view. I do go along with the idea of it just being nations deciding that those things on which they can properly collaborate, doing that. So, and there is an element of smugness about some parts of the EU which says that we know best and we will tell. There's one good example of that. I mentioned how good they are with regional aid. They funded some projects in the south of Italy, and in each area across the EU you've got an agency that looks after structural and social funds. The agency in the south of Italy was the mafia. They had the infrastructure. Not a joke, it was. And there was this factory was being built, and the EU went and inspected it, and they said, no, look, your security is not good enough for whatever the factory was. And they said, you're going to have gates of this, security level, and we're going to come back and inspect it. And they did. They went back and inspected it, and right enough, they put the gates up, and they were of the required level. There was no fence around the factory, you just walked past the gates, but they had the gates at the right level. So I think there are things, and also in terms of their accounts, I don't think it's a wasteful organisation in particular. Any form of government will have a level of waste in it, but I do think it's important that they're very transparent. I think also things like registers of interests. I was very aware, I was on a committee of the region, there was very little declaration of what people's interests were. So I think mainly it's around transparency and further democratisation, and I don't think pushing continually for ever closer union is right. But those are my views, and you'll get a range of different views, both in the SNP and elsewhere.
Yeah, it was interesting what you're saying about Johnson saying, I don't want to see Scottish Government ministers travelling, and corollary to that is, I don't want to see Scottish Government institutions abroad. To what extent is that bluster, or can you do something about that?
Well, you know that the UK often crows about its soft power. I'll give you two examples of that. Once, when I was on the committee of the region, there was a big forthcoming Lisbon Treaty, and the committee of the region set up a committee, a constitutional committee, and my group in the Scottish Parliament, in the European Committee of the Regions, was one of the smaller ones, although I managed to become the first ever non-Irish president of the group, but it was the smaller of, fourth largest. And I know the Foreign Office were not at all happy that I, as an SNP member, was going to be on this. I was only, I think, a substitute on the committee. I never attended a single meeting because I wasn't called to. But they tried everything they could to make sure that didn't happen. There's also another story I could tell you about going to the Falklands as well. Christine and I went to the Falklands in 2012, and I was going as Veterans Minister, although I'd served in the Falklands War, and the efforts that they made to make sure that we did go in the end, because we managed to get around it. I had to phone the Chief Minister in the Falklands and go through it. But so I think the UK operates with soft power, as they would call it all the time. The difficulty is the Scottish Government's new facility in Berlin is in the UK Assembly, Embassy, sorry. So how they're going to prevent UK ministers going to, and also the same is true in Ireland as well. The Scottish Government have a place in the UK Embassy there. So they can withdraw support, and sometimes there's some excellent civil servants around the world that have been helpful to Scottish ministers. I think they'll try and withdraw support there. How they can actually achieve a ban, which has been talked about, I'm much less sure. I know they're not keen on freedom of movement right enough, but I thought that's taken it a bit too far. I'd imagine it's through such influence as they have. Although the really interesting thing, and we shouldn't forget about this, the UK, to state the obvious, is no longer a member of the EU. The EU will never take against one of its members. I mean, look at what's happened in Spain. The EU should be much stronger in speaking out what's happened in Spain, but Spain is a member, and they won't do that. The UK is no longer a member, and if you saw that projected Scotland Europe thing on the European Commission building last night, I think that is really quite significant. They, of course, will still have regard to wanting to get a good trade deal with the UK, and I know who my money's on to win in that trade deal. I've seen the way the EU operates in trade deals. They know what they're doing. We've not had trade negotiators for 30 odd years in this country. I know some of the people in Scotland who they tapped on the shoulder to be trade negotiators when Brexit first happened, who had no experience at all and were stunned to be asked to do this. So So they will have an eye on how good a trade deal, and they'll want to maintain a relationship with the UK, but they don't have that loyalty to the UK anymore. And some of the comments coming out of European countries about Scotland and how quickly they would want to see Scotland exceed, I think that, and I think you'll see that going back to the lady's point about the next year and how that plays out. That's the other side of it. The EU has got no remit to speak up for the UK anymore. And the other thing, just one briefly, I went to Berlin a couple of years ago as a cabinet secretary, and they held this dinner. And for the first and only time, I agreed to stay in the UK ambassador's residence. And he held a dinner for me, and various folk, including senior members of all the political parties in the German Parliament. And this woman who was with the CDU, so right-wing, right-ish, conservative, older woman, was challenging the ambassador, who I think, and I don't want to get him in trouble, I think he was probably quite uncomfortable with Brexit, but that's his remit. And she said at one point, she got up from her, there was a big table with lots of people there, up from her chair, came round and put her arms round me and says, "We like our Scottish friends, they want to stay with us." And we should not underestimate the extent to which people in the EU feel personally affronted and rebuffed by the UK. And the reverse of that is the extent they are much more aware that Scotland wants to be part of the EU. So I think that's going to be really important in the next few months.
And that reflects my experience. I'm just back from Germany actually, and speaking to a lot of German people, and they were very aware of the mess of Westminster politics, and very aware of what's happening in Scotland, and very supportive.
Bottom line here, we have the Scottish Parliament now, but they want to nip this away, they want to take it away. What do we do to take it away?
Well, we have to see, well, we've opposed it at each point. I mean, to be fair to the Scottish Government, every time it's been attempted, they've opposed it. The only and most effective way to stop it completely is to get that continuing increasing support for independence. Not even having to wait until the point it's expressed in a referendum. Before then, you will see a change in the attitude. If they start to see 55, 56% support in independence, if you see similar figures supporting a referendum now, that's the one thing that they are consoling themselves with just now. They've not got a clear statement that the people of Scotland are demanding a referendum right now. But when that happens, and I think that's why I think the statement from Unison is really important, because you're building up that civic base, excuse me, and I think that becomes unstoppable, and they realise it becomes unstoppable. But in the meantime, you're right. The Scottish Government and everyone in the Scottish Parliament is concerned about it, and it is an absolute disgrace that Tory and Lib Dem MSPs couldn't care less about this. I mean, if you watch the conduct of the wee band of Lib Dem MSPs in the Scottish Parliament, they're more unionist than the Tories, and they're always looking to the Tories for approval in the chamber. Willie Rennie, Alec Cole-Hamilton in particular. And they've decided to define themselves by attaching themselves to the union come what may, voting to take down the EU flag in the Scottish Parliament. I mean, it's absolutely, and they say that we weren't sufficiently committed to the EU. So I don't think we're going to get much scrutiny from them when it comes to it. There's some Labour MSPs now are starting to question that and say, no, this, and to be fair, and sometimes even Lib Dems have supported a couple of the refusals to consent to particular actions of the UK government. But we have to be vigilant. The Scottish Government, so they've got ministers for every area. They know if someone's trying to encroach on their powers, and they have to do something proactively in order to take further powers. But it's funny, Christine and I were looking at a tweet this morning, and it was said, somebody tweeted, look at what they've done. They can now just abolish our parliament. And I have to say, 2 or 3 years ago, I thought completely fanciful. But I know there are some that are desperate to do exactly that. The best defence, both for the Parliament and the powers that it currently has, is that expression of public support and a vigilant government that stops it from happening, I think.
Do you have a question? Yes.
Keith, on that point, do you not think that the Westminster trying to scrap the Scottish Parliament will massively ramp up support for independence and completely counterproductive?
I should say I don't think they'll do it. I don't think that. But I'm just, the point I was making is it's much more believable to people now than it was a few years ago. It's actually now written into the written into law, although like any law in the UK Parliament is sovereign, it's supreme, it doesn't get bound by its successors. They can change that law. it was Gordon Brown that was most adamant that this would be rooted in law, constitution, it could never be superseded. But then again, he said a lot of things which never really happened. But you're right. I mean, I think even they, the more sensible people on that side, would think, you know, the Parliament is widely criticised, as all parliaments are, but you try taking it away from people in Scotland. I mean, just on one particular example, if you look, and anybody that's been in the Parliament, the number of people visiting that Parliament is huge in Scotland. Every kid, I've been taking school groups round for the last 14 years there. So many of the kids are now voting and they see it as their Parliament. So I think it's practically, it would be absolutely a bizarre and stupid thing to try to do in the first place. So I don't think it's going to happen, but we do have to be vigilant.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to take Chairman's privilege and ask the last question, if you don't mind. Nicola mentioned in her speech a reference to commissioning the Electoral Commission to carry out an investigation and test the question. What exactly does that mean in practice?
And again, I think probably Christina's better able to answer this as being a member of the government than me, but my understanding is that Mike Russell has now asked the Electoral Commission to look at the question that we had last time. Should Scotland be an independent country, whoever it's expressed last time, because we've now got this preposterous kind of position from some, not just Tories, but others saying it should we leave or remain, or changing it so it's not a yes/no answer, because I think yes is positive and no is negative. So I think what Mike is doing is asking the Electoral Commission, I know he's been in discussions with them, to give a view on that question. I'm not sure on what grounds you can say it was perfectly legitimate last time and find a reason not to have it this time, especially given the fact that the very fact you had it last time is now understood by people exactly what it means. And to argue otherwise is to argue that 55% that voted no didn't really know what they were voting for, I suppose. So I think that's what it is, so that's being done, and I would see that as a fundamental part of the early preparations for a referendum. And bear in mind that this week we've seen the Royal Assent for the Referendums Act, none of which gets round the Section 30 issue, but it all makes sure the practical preparations are further advanced.
Okay. Right, I think that's our time up for this session, so thank you very much, Keith, for your time and answering all the questions. It's very much appreciated. Thank you. What comes next?
I think we'll have a wee break, 5 minutes, 10 minutes.